So let's kick off today with session 1, the link between gut microbes, immunity and disease. Our first speaker is Dr. Carolyn Childs. Now, Dr. Childs is Associate Professor in Nutritional Sciences at the University of Southampton, with a keen research interest in the impact of nutrition on the immune system. So I'll hand over to Carolyn now for her talk.
Hey, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see the chat happening in the comments and the Discord. So I look forward to interacting with all of you as the morning goes on. So as Sophie kindly introduced, my name's Dr. Caroline Childs. This is where I work at the University of Southampton in this institute called the Institute of Developmental Sciences. And I also want to acknowledge that I work as part of a much wider team, with all of us having varied interests in the role of nutrition and metabolism and health. My particular interest is the effect that this has on the immune system. And so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about this morning. So some of the topics that I aim to cover together with you this morning is really focusing on those links between the food that we eat, how our immune system works, and the role that the gut microbiota has in that process. And one of the challenges in working in immune system research is that it's a complex system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It also interacts with many other systems. So we're focusing on the gut microbiome this morning, but there are other things which there are important interactions on. Another challenge with working in the immune system is that it changes over our lifetime. And so in my talk today, I'm going to focus on some of these factors. I'm going to highlight a few foods and nutrients, which there's evidence that they have significant immune effects. And I'm just going to touch a little bit on the effects that I think might be important moving beyond the gut. And so looking further at a whole body experience. So let's start by talking a little bit about the complexity of our immune system. So our immune system, we might think of white blood cells going around in our bloodstream, but those are actually only about 10% of the immune cells that you have in your body. So you have a whole range of immune cells found in different locations. Some of these are in specialist organs. So, for example, just in front of your heart, you have a gland called the thymus, which is where your T cells come from. Many other of your immune cells are generated in your bone marrow. So if you have a bone marrow transplant, that's where they would collect those from. You've probably heard of your spleen, which is surveilling your blood for any potential pathogens that there may be. And we've all probably felt our lymph nodes getting swollen when we've had an infection, for example. So we have these range of organs, specialized tissues, different cell types, and then we have resident immune cells in almost all parts of our body as well, ready to be there in the case of any injury or trauma or infection. And so this whole complex system works together to protect us. And fundamentally, it does this by identifying things which are ourself and should be tolerated, and things which are not and perhaps need to be eliminated or destroyed rapidly. So this is how, for example, our body provides us with some protection against infection, whether that's from bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites. It also provides us with a degree of protection against the growth of cancerous cells. Of course, that's not infallible, but that is part of what our immune system does. If you have an injury, whether that's a scratch or a surgical injury, your immune system is a part of the response to that. And on the whole, our immune system is there to protect us and so to be beneficial. But it doesn't take account of the effect that it's having. And so your immune system can actually destroy your own tissues in its efforts to try and protect us against things which are harmful. So it will sacrifice tissues, unfortunately, at the expense of the action that it's trying to take to be protective. So I'm going to take you through a few examples of that complexity of the immune system. And let me start us off with an example that we're probably all familiar with, of having a splinter in our finger. You'll know when you get a splinter in your finger, you experience things like redness, might feel hot, it's probably going to be painful, your finger might get swollen, and you may lose function. For example, you may not be able to use that finger to type in the way that you normally would. Those are all classic markers of inflammation. And a little bit of inflammation in the right place at the right time is a good thing. A small amount of inflammation dealing with that splinter means that that's dealt with at a local level, and doesn't then have to become an infection which is tracking up into the rest of your hand, into your bloodstream, causing you serious ill health, for example. So if we look at the complex things which are happening at that stage, we have the splinter entering, the cells which are damaged in that local area, releasing chemical signals into the environment to say something is going wrong here. That attracts cells from your bloodstream to move into the tissues, or the cells that were resident in those tissues to start taking action, fluid moving into the area. And so all of these complex interactions between cells are what causes the redness, heat, swelling, pain, and loss of function associated with inflammation. Now, we're looking at that at a splinter level, but you can imagine if you have perhaps a more chronic inflammation, such as an inflammatory bowel disease, these consequences of swelling and pain, discomfort, movement of immune cells from one place to another can be part of those symptoms that we see in conditions such as that. Another example of how our immune system works is that it has an aspect of memory. So these are my two daughters when they experience chickenpox. As you can see, it's quite a recognizable condition causing a skin rash. Children don't feel very happy when they have it, but for most children, this is not a life-threatening illness. This is a fairly routine childhood illness in the UK, which self-resolves over about 7 to 10 days, although those are a challenging 7 to 10 days. But this is an example of the memory that our immune system has. Now that my daughters have both been exposed to chickenpox, on re-exposure, they won't exhibit any of these same symptoms again, or are very unlikely to. And so that's how our immune system remembers. Our immune cells can become educated to a particular bacteria, virus, pathogen, and so that when it's re-encountered, we have a stronger, more effective response and perhaps don't exhibit any symptoms at all. And this is fundamentally how vaccination processes work. We expose ourselves to something, it trains our immune cells, and we retain a degree of protection after that vaccination. Now, as we've all experienced through COVID times, how often you have those vaccinations, how many you need to have, that varies a great deal between different disease processes. So, for example, if, like me, you've had your vaccination to hepatitis B, I think you probably would have had a series of 2 or 3 vaccinations, and that's your protection for a lifetime. Other things like influenza, like me, you may be invited to have a new vaccination every winter to reflect the changing strains of influenza circulating. But all of these are part of our acquired or memory immune function. So I just wanted to introduce you to those aspects of your immune system. The innate side, which is immediate, strong inflammation linked, primarily like with a splinter, and then the memory component, which is longer lasting. And one of the challenges in working with immune function that I mentioned is this change over our lifetime. And so one example of that is the pattern that we see with allergic diseases. So typically someone with a food allergy will present with perhaps a rash around their mouth on exposure to that food initially. Perhaps they're prone to skin conditions like eczema in early life. As they move through childhood, perhaps start to get allergic asthma and wheezing. And then perhaps as they move into teenage years and adulthood, experience more hay fever, allergy type symptoms. So although we're looking at the same person, the way their immune system is working, the tissues which are being affected, those things are changing over the lifetime. So we can see when our immune system is not working optimally, those things can be quite variable in the early days of life. We see similar challenges at the other end of the age spectrum. So as we age, our immune system also declines. And that's part of the reason why COVID has been so significant for older adults in the population. And one of the immune organs I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the thymus, this is what it looks like, this kind of 2-lobed organ sitting in front of your heart. And that's at its peak during childhood. And the thymus is the place where your brand new T cells come from. So in early life and childhood, you have a fantastic ability to generate new T cells all the time. Sadly, as you reach my age here, I'm going to be 42 tomorrow, my thymus now is probably almost all made of fat. I probably have very little ability to make new T cells anymore. And so that gives me challenges if I encounter something new for the first time in later life, as we've experienced in the coronavirus pandemic. But this is a normal part of aging. We've known that the thymus is at its peak in childhood and declines with aging for a very long period of time. What we don't know is whether there's anything we can do about it to slow down that process, to make our peak higher in childhood. So it's very interesting to think about those normal processes that happen across our life course and the role that potentially nutrition or our gut health may have in interacting with those. Now, one of the other challenges in the immune system is that there are many things that affect how well your immune system works. You probably have a feeling for whether you're the type of person who gets every cold and bug going, or whether you're someone who's quite rarely unwell. And so you may have a picture of how optimally you think your immune system is working. Some of the things that affect how your immune system works are outside of your control. You don't get to choose your genetics. We can't make ourselves any younger. But some things are modifiable within our life course, whether that's by decisions made for us, such as vaccination history, whether those are things which are not totally in our control, so our exposure to pathogens, early life events which have happened. But there are some modifiable factors as well. And of course, as a nutritionist, one of the things I'm interested in is the role that diet has, links closely with the gut microbiome, and other things related to nutrition. So obesity status, alcohol consumption, for example. These are all things which are potentially modifiable and that we know are causes of variation in how well your immune system works. Now, the challenge is that these interactions are really complex. So let's take, for example, how a baby is at risk of having food allergy or not. So I have allergies, and so I sometimes ponder on what were the factors that caused me to be a person with allergies. And there are a whole range of factors which scientists have identified as being significant predictors of how likely you are to have a food allergy. So one of those is the way that you're born, whether you're born by vaginal delivery or cesarean section, with children born by cesarean section significantly more likely to experience food allergy. And that's something that potentially links to our microbiome. So during a vaginal birth, infants are exposed to the maternal microbiome, whereas in a cesarean section birth, infants may be more exposed to the skin microbiome. Now, while those effects are significant, it's important for us to put those into context in terms of the relative number of cases that could predict. And so some authors have estimated that just by mode of birth, you can only estimate between 1% and 4% of the food allergy cases that you can attribute to that factor alone. There are many other factors with important roles. So, for example, the type and timing of when food is introduced, how our hygiene practices have changed over the generations. Variations in our socioeconomic status are known to link to differences in levels of allergic disease, and other factors such as whether there are pets in the home. Someone with more older brothers and sisters is less likely to get an allergy than a firstborn child. Antibiotic use in early life, if an infant has recurrent ear infections, for example, does that have an interaction? And what kind of exposures does that child have? I have a picture here of a child happily playing in the mud. Some children live in quite urbanized environments. There can be quite a lot of variation in terms of the natural exposures that an individual has in their environment. So we're focusing on the gut today, and this is one of my favorite cartoons, talking about how the gut and the immune system works. So in this cartoon here, we've got a dendritic cell reaching that arm out into the gut to see what's there. And so that's what your immune system is doing. It's constantly surveilling what's happening in the gut. And then here we've got a T cells asking, have you found anything interesting? Do I need to do anything? So this is, I think, a nice cartoon to illustrate how our gut and immune system work together. Now, of course, in reality, that picture is a little bit more complex, but we can see the same principles apply. So here's a picture where we can see one of these dendritic cells extending that process between the cell layers there, reaching up to a bacteria. We can see in the gut there are areas of specialized immune tissue called Peyer's patches, rich in immune cells. We can see that signals coming from the wider immune system are influencing what's happening in that local environment. But I'd also like to point out that it's a two-way street. So as well as our immune system sensing what's happening in the gut, There are also things from our immune system being secreted into the gut. So on this image, you can see IgA coating some of those bacteria in the gut, and also sampling some of those components from the gut as well and seeing what's there. So a real communication happening between our immune system and our gut all the time. And I would like to invite all of you to reflect on the constant and massive antigenic stimulation we put on our bodies every day. Each of us eats, let's say, 1 to 2 kilos of food a day, and our body has to surveil all of that and check whether it's safe to continue on its path, or whether we've just eaten something contaminated with salmonella and we need to launch a strong and protective immune response. But at the same time as being that really strong defending system, we also want to have a degree of tolerance. If I eat a peanut, I don't want my body to think that those proteins in the peanut are something harmful to me. I want them to tolerate that and allow me to digest and absorb that without me having an allergic response. So our immune system really has to walk this tightrope of balancing really strong protection against harmful pathogens while tolerating normal exposures, normal food proteins, friendly bacteria in our gut, which aren't causing any distress, allowing them to colonize our gut. So really a difficult balance for our immune system to walk, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit about some foods now as a nutritionist. So probably the one you may be most aware of with direct links between the food that you eat and the effect on your gut health are probiotics. So these are live microorganisms intended to confer health benefits. Most probiotics that we see are species or strains of lactobacilli or bifidobacteria, but there are others as well. And generally in the market, we tend to see these probiotics introduced in yogurts or fermented milks. But of course, there are many other foods which contain live bacteria, whether that's fermented vegetables, sourdough bread, for example. There's lots of other components like fermented foods, which are of a growing interest in how they may help us introduce bacteria to our gut. And I think I saw a really interesting paper once which said almost all the lactobacilli we have in our gut comes from the fact that humans have eaten cheese for a long time, and so that's how it's managed to colonize us. And so I think there's a great deal of interest in probiotic foods, whether those are foods specifically designed as functional foods to deliver probiotics to us, or whether it's incidental to the way that we routinely make those fermented foods in our patterns of food processing. Another aspect very closely related to gut health is prebiotics. So these are non-digestible oligosaccharides, which are selectively used by those microorganisms in our gut, and again, conferring a health benefit to the person that consumes them. There's a wide variety of these: inulin, fructooligosaccharides, galacto-oligosaccharides, xylo-oligosaccharides, for example. But what they have in common is that their carbohydrate bonds are ones which we don't have human enzymes to digest, but that the bacteria in our guts can digest those and use them for their energy. Because these are carbohydrate sources, we can include those in a different variety of foods than we see probiotics. So they can, for example, be included in baked products like breads or biscuits. So those probiotics and prebiotics are probably the two functional foods that we might think most of when it comes to gut health. If we think about how we might modify our gut health through the food that we eat, one simple way of thinking about it is, okay, if I take a probiotic that contains some nice bifidobacterium lactis, for example, those bacteria colonize my gut. They physically occupy space and so prevent adhesion of pathogenic bacteria like salmonella, should I eat those, and so protect me against those pathogenic bacteria. And this is the way that probiotics provide protection against, for example, traveler's diarrhea. By having a good colonization of your gut with friendly bacteria, it just reduces the opportunity for any pathogens to be able to adhere. But this is not the only way that probiotics or changes to your beneficial bacteria could have these health benefits. The bacteria metabolism itself produces products which are known to inhibit the growth of some bacteria. So one example is short-chain fatty acids. Those are produced, acidify the gut contents, and some bacteria particularly don't like those. But there's also the role, those interactions between bacteria and our immune system I showed you on that cartoon earlier. Similarly, these short-chain fatty acids can also affect the immune cells in that area. And so that can provide us with either local defenses within the gut, but actually can also have effects beyond the gut as well. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through our talk today. One thing I think is important to highlight is that not all probiotics are the same. So here's just one study as an example, which looked at 4 different types of probiotic bacteria and the effect that that had on the immune system. And the thing I want to highlight to you that I think is illustrated quite nicely here is that those 4 different strains all caused quite different effects, some of them almost opposite to each other between the different strains. Some of these we may describe as immunostimulatory, others we may describe as immunoregulatory. So quite different effects of the same strain, but also it matters who you give that to. And so in this study, they were using immune cells from young versus older adults. And you can see again, very marked differences in the way that younger and older people respond to the same strain of bacteria. So important for us to remember when we're talking about probiotics is to think about that specificity and how certain we are that the effects we're seeing would happen across other probiotics, or is this something which is unique to this particular strain or species in its particular context. That said, the evidence for probiotics, I think, is very good in terms of their health benefits beyond the gut. So this is one review which has been done looking at the role that probiotics may have in preventing acute upper respiratory tract infections, so effectively cold and flu-like illnesses. These studies combined together found that probiotics were better than the placebo in reducing the number of people who experience cold or flu-like symptoms, the number of people who experience those multiple times, significantly reduced antibiotic use in studies which looked at that, and in studies looking at school children, significantly reduced school absences. So these are all very important factors, both in terms of someone's individual well-being, but also economically, the effect that that could have at population level of reducing antibiotic use by 1/3. The challenge that we have in nutritional science is that reviews like this will often comment on there being a lot of heterogeneity or variety in the data, perhaps due to the different strains and contexts that I described earlier, but often the evidence is rated as being of low or very low quality. So that is something I view as a personal challenge to me as a nutrition scientist, to make sure that the evidence that I produce is going to be rated as being of a high or very high quality. There are some natural challenges to doing that in nutrition research. For example, can be quite challenging to make a perfectly matched and blinded placebo if the intervention you're giving is something like a probiotic yogurt or a blueberry. How can you match that with a placebo? So there are some natural challenges in nutrition research, but I think this is something that all of us in the community need to try and do our best to address so that our research is viewed as being of the highest quality. An area which I've started looking at more recently in terms of immune function and links with gut health is phytochemicals. So these are the compounds which give fruits and vegetables their bright and rich colours. So, for example, in mangoes or pomegranates. And we've known for some time that these compounds have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. There's also evidence that they interact with the same kind of expressions of illness, reflecting changes in immune function that we saw for probiotics. So, for example, recent studies have shown that being given supplements with these phytochemicals can reduce gastrointestinal or upper respiratory tract infections in school-age children, and may have a role in prevention and treatment of influenza, for example. So I have a growing interest in how these phytochemicals may be interacting with our gut microbiome to have some of these beneficial effects. Now, one of the challenges with studying these phytochemicals is that we need to take a pharmacokinetic view of how they may have those effects. So let's imagine that I eat a lovely bright red apple today, full of, let's say, taxofolin as a phytochemical. What is my response to that going to be? First of all, how good am I at absorbing that? How good is my digestive system? What is my gastric transit rate? How much of that do I have the potential to absorb? Am I going to digest it or modify it? Am I going to form metabolites of that in my system? And how much of it is going to be excreted and by what route? And those things, I think, will be quite variable between individuals for two reasons. One is the role of the gut microbiome. So if I feed a red apple to someone like me, is that the same if I feed the red apple to someone who has quite a different diet pattern from me? Maybe they have a different profile of gut bacteria, which will have different effects in perhaps metabolizing those compounds. For example, I don't often eat soya or tofu. If I compared myself to someone who routinely ate that 2 to 3 times a week, I would expect us to have a different pattern of bacteria, and so perhaps have different abilities to metabolize those compounds. Similarly, my genes may be different. Pardon me. There are genes that affect how we respond to medications. We know about the role of enzymes like cytochrome P450, and how you metabolize drugs can be varied depending on your genetic background. The same can be happening in terms of how you manage these phytochemicals. Your unique genetic background can mean that these stay longer or shorter in your system, are rapidly converted to something else, or stay as they are. Are they excreted fast or slow? All of those things can be variable between individuals. And that's another one of the wonderful challenges, I think, of working in nutrition research. How can we address all of those things? So I just want to cast your mind back to this cartoon I showed you earlier of our gut barrier sensing what's happening in our gut contents. And the thing I want you to note, now that I'm showing it to you again now, is how tightly those cells are lined up next to each other in your gut barrier. And we quite often think about how important it is that this gut barrier be impermeable, and that we only allow things across that we really want to, and that we don't allow things just to passively leak across our gut. But a leaky gut or increased gut permeability is something that we see in certain diseases or certain stages of life. So, for example, newborn or early preterm infants may have increased gut permeability, and so have less ability to control what's being transported across that gut barrier. People with inflammatory bowel diseases may also have increased gut permeability. And there's growing evidence accumulating that changes in gut permeability can also be linked to some non-communicable diseases, such as diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and patterns of food consumption or markers of conditions such as obesity. So this is an area of growing interest, and one that I'm very interested in, because I think, as well as the potential for bacteria to leak across the gut, there's also the potential for nutrients to move across as well, and what effect do each of those have? And I imagine that could be quite a complex thing to unpick. One example of a nutrient that may leak across an infant's gut are human milk oligosaccharides. These are compounds with prebiotic type effects, and they're found in quite high quantities in human breast milk, 10 to 20 grams per litre, which is comparable to the amount of protein in human breast milk. So really a significant component. That the quantity and type that a woman produces in her breast milk is highly variable between women, and again depends on their genetic background and what enzymes they have for assembling these different human milk oligosaccharides. But this is something which is of great interest to those of us working in nutrition, and how that links with the gut microbiome. So, for example, studies have been done to look to see if we know these human milk oligosaccharides are a significant component of breast milk, but are not present in formula milk. Can we add them to formula milk, and do we see any effects on diseases linked to the immune system? So this was a study here looking at the incidence of eczema in newborn babies, which, as I showed you earlier in that time course, is one of the predictors of a child which will perhaps later have other allergies as well. And this is what's known as a survival plot. So this line here is showing the proportion of children who are still eczema-free. So at the beginning, all children were eczema-free. And as the study goes on, a number of children get found to have eczema. So at this point, 10% of children would have eczema at this point here. So this is following over the first year of life. And this is the pattern we see amongst breastfed infants in blue. Some breastfed infants get eczema. When infants are formula fed, they seem to be more likely to develop eczema, or at least to develop it earlier. And in this study, when they supplemented the formula with a type of prebiotic, that kept the incidence of eczema closer to what they may see in a breastfed infant. So very exciting and interesting results. But the challenge always is, how long do these effects last for? So this was looking in the first year of life. If we look again at these children when they're 5 years of age, we don't see any significant effect of the mode of feeding for those children later on. And so it's very difficult, isn't it, to think about when you're giving advice, what time frame are you talking about? What scale of benefit do you think is likely to happen? How many of these things are truly choices for people as well? So I think that's perhaps a philosophical question, but I think interesting as scientists for us to make sure when we're looking at data to think about the time course and the translation of that data and how that may apply to wider populations. One final nutrient I want to touch on that I've spent some of my time working on is omega-3 fatty acids. These are found in foods such as oily fish, and I think are a really nice example of how nutrients can affect the immune system. To my mind, there are three key ways that nutrients can affect your immune system: by being the literal building blocks of your cells. So omega-3 fatty acids are what are part of your cell membranes, and the more of them you have in your cell membranes, the more flexible your cell will be, which can be good for some cells and not so good for others. They're also precursors for other things that our immune system needs to make. So omega-3 fatty acids are precursors to prostaglandins, which are a pro-inflammatory molecule, but the ones which are derived from omega-3 fats are less pro-inflammatory than ones derived from omega-6 fats, such as those found in sunflower oil, for example. But also, of course, the effects on the gut microbiome. We know a great deal about the effect of carbohydrates in our diet on the gut microbiome. We're learning more about the role of proteins in our gut microbiome. I think the role of lipids in our gut microbiome is less well understood, but I would suspect does have a role as well. But let's take this disease example, rheumatoid arthritis, a significant autoimmune disease causing joint pain, joint stiffness, time to fatigue, for example, and a whole number of double-blind, placebo-controlled, high-quality trials have been done of fish oil in rheumatoid arthritis, and overall these see improvements across a wide range of clinical outcomes. This has been shown in a number of systematic reviews now. Yet despite this, the current advice in the UK from NICE, the Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, the current advice is to inform adults with rheumatoid arthritis that if they wish to experiment with their diet, there is no strong evidence that their arthritis will benefit. And so I find this interesting, that contrast between the scientific literature and policy and decisions which are being made in terms of those advice. And I think that's another challenge for us in the nutrition community, to improve our communication, and making sure we have the highest quality research will help us to do that. Now, I don't wish to say that fish oil will cure all conditions by any means. It doesn't seem to have significant effects on other inflammatory conditions. There's controversial data on the impact this may have on inflammatory bowel disease. And so there's not one nutrient which can have benefits across all conditions. That I don't believe that would be possible. But I think it's important for us to remember that the food we eat is more than just a collection of nutrients. So, for example, if I persuade you that eating more walnuts will be good for your heart health, are you someone who'd say, well, great, I'll eat more walnuts today and every day? Or are you someone who might think, well, I don't really like walnuts, but I could switch to walnut oil in my cooking? Or are you someone who says, I don't want to change any of the food that I eat or cooking methods that I do, I'd rather just take the capsule with walnut oil in it. Thank you, Caroline. And we can think about how those things are different. If you eat a whole walnut, you're not just getting the oils, you're also getting protein, phytochemicals, fiber, vitamins, minerals. And that is different, isn't it, than just looking at a strictly nutrient-based level. And I wanted to share this paper I found, which talked about the concept of nutritionism, where we describe all the health benefits just as the matter of a specific quantity and type of nutrient, and perhaps forget the role of those cultural, psychological, emotional aspects that we have around food and the patterns of diets that we choose to eat or have available to us. I know I'm slightly over time, so I will just quickly say that something I'm very interested in is the role that the liver may have in moderating these effects between the gut and our immune system. We know that our gut bacteria also produce a number of vitamins for us. And so I think these effects of liver, bile, gut microbiome, I think these are all emerging areas for research. So just to summarize, I want you to take away from this that the vast majority of the immune cells you have in your body are associated with your gut. It's been estimated about 70% of your immune cells are in or around your gut, and they have to strike that difficult balance between protection and tolerance. We know that both your gut microbiome and your immune system are changed by your diet, and that there are specific effects at different points in the lifetime. There are likely to be a whole range of other interactions. I've focused mainly on the gut and the immune system today, a little bit of a focus on the lung with allergic disease and respiratory tract infections. But of course, there are a whole range of other systems that can be impacted as well. But alongside that, I hope I've persuaded you to think a little bit about how we communicate this nutrition science, the importance of doing high quality research, and of being able to communicate that, I hope, clearly and effectively. So I'd just like to acknowledge the great team of students and colleagues that I have, and the current people who are my research funders, just to acknowledge that as well. And I'd like to thank you all for joining me this morning, and I'd be very happy to speak about any questions that you might have for me.
Thank you, Caroline. That was an extremely interesting talk. So many things for me to think about. So if any of our live viewers would like to ask any questions to Caroline, please do post them either on Discord or on the YouTube chat. We've already had a few questions come in, and I've got a couple that I'd really like to ask you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So, Caroline, can you tell me more about the role that obesity has on immune function? I mean, given the increasing prevalence of obesity in the UK, it's quite an important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Most people in the UK now are overweight or obese. And so we really do need to take seriously the effect that this has on the immune system. Some of that we've seen, unfortunately, through the COVID pandemic, haven't we, in terms of people living with obesity being at much higher risk of morbidity and mortality. But there are reasons beyond just the physical load of fat tissue. It's more than that. It's a living tissue. It includes immune cells, and some people with obesity have more infiltration of immune cells into that fat tissue, and that causes an underlying long-term inflammation. And so, for example, people living with obesity are more likely to have conditions like osteoarthritis and other inflammatory joint conditions. And we may understand some of that, for example, on the hips and knees. We may think, well, that's the added physical weight. They can also experience those symptoms in the hands. So it's not just about the physical aspect of body weight. It's also about the broader inflammation that causes.
Thank you.
Yep.
I've got another question.
Yep.
Why is the role of the liver and bile an emerging area of interest when it comes to immunity?
Yeah, I think some of that comes down to our technology. So as we're able to look at more things, that gives us greater ability. So my colleagues with expertise in mass spectrometry can now look at bile acids and all their various secondary bile acids. So bile is what helps you digest fat in your diet. So that's why I'm interested in it. Your gut bacteria doesn't like bile because it can destroy those bacteria. So many of your gut bacteria modify that bile to make it more tolerant to them. And our body has quite a good recycling system. So we reuse that bile. And so the way that our gut has changed it affects the pattern that we have. And there are certain patterns of bile acids that seem to be associated with health or ill health, for example. And so that probably links to differences in gut bacteria. So some of these emerging areas, I think, come from our ability to measure more things. And so it's only as that kind of collaborative working with people with access to that kind of technology and information, we can start to see those links. I'm sure there are many other links as well that we can explore around the body that our gut health is impacting on.
So lots of possible ideas for future research collaborations.
Yes,
Love
there's,
to
yeah.
see that discussed on Discord. So one of the topics that's come up on Discord is discussing sourdough. Which Salam has said, sourdough is a great idea, but would the live bacteria die through the baking cooking process? And Molly has followed up that with saying she thinks the idea of sourdough is that the bacteria and yeast break down the starch and proteins with enzymes. And so maybe that has some benefits. Do you have any thoughts on sourdough, Caroline?
I think all of those things are probably true. I think it probably depends a little bit on whether you're making the sourdough yourself or whether you are buying it in a supermarket. So let's imagine I'm making it in my kitchen. While my food hygiene is good, I won't say that it's a germ-free environment. And so I may be exposed to some of those bacteria in the making of that process. The person who commented about baking destroying live bacteria is absolutely right. That's what we would expect. The question is, does that matter? Does it matter if the bacteria is live or dead? It matters if you want it to colonize your gut. A dead bacteria is not going to do that. But if it's just in terms of providing a signal to your immune system, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that whether you consume that bacteria live or dead perhaps is less important. If you're trying to stimulate your immune system, you may get the same stimulating response, whether that bacteria is live or dead. And I'm sorry, I've lost my train of the third question, which was also a good one. The third part was about about changes to the bread itself, wasn't it? About breaking down fibers.
Down the starch proteins of enzymes. So does that have any benefits?
Yeah, and I think that's true as well. So I think that's one of the challenges with nutrition, is that I think all of those things are correct at the same time. And so that's the problem, is quite often we're looking at things from our area of interest. You know, if you're a baker compared to if you are someone with, for example, celiac disease, looking at ways to reduce gluten in flours. You know, we look at things from our perspective. But I think that's one of the interesting things, is that I think all of those things are true and interesting to think about.
Great. Just to mention that if we don't get to your question today, we will try and follow up with as many answers as possible. So do keep asking. Something else I'd like to know, Caroline, is what do you think are important topics for the future in nutrition research? So if funding wasn't an issue, collaborative partners weren't an issue, what would you really like to get your teeth into?
Yeah, well, if time and money were no object, really what we would like to know, I think, is that kind of complex interplay between genetics, our environment, the food we eat, the physical activity we do, other aspects of our life, psychosocial aspects, for example, having a study that examined across all of those with an interest in saying which is putting us most on a path to health or most on the path to disease in a way which is translatable into action. So let's say, for example, I discover that eating fruits and vegetables is good for you, right? That's something that we already know. But how do we make that so that that's something easy for all of us to do? There are some things, you know, we all know this, that we should be eating more fruit and vegetables, but are we all doing it? And why aren't we all doing it? And so I think that's why links with people with interests in sociology, psychology, behavior change is really important for scientists, because it's one thing for me to say, well, look, it's easy, just go and eat 5 fruit and veg a day, you'll have lovely gut bacteria, great fiber, you know, but do I do that? You know, what are the barriers I face? You know, if I walk into my local coffee shop, do I have free choice of what fruit and vegetables are available to me? My children going to school get offered a free piece of fruit and vegetables at school. There are interventions that we can do to modify the environment that we're in and our accessibility to those things, but it's not equitable. If I think about where I can walk to from my house, I cannot buy the fruits and vegetables I would like to buy in walking distance from my house. Other people in more urbanized environments may have an advantage in that regard compared to me in a more rural environment. So it's not equitable. And I think that's the challenge for the future, is that moving away from just saying, well, look, just eat more fruits and vegetables, to thinking about why and how important is that? You know, or are we stigmatizing people and saying, well, look, you're not doing the right thing, that's why your child has allergic disease? What are the things we can do to enable those things to happen?
Yeah, and we're all creatures of habit, aren't we?
Yeah.
I've had a really good question come in from Neve. And they say some plant-based oat kefir is made using cultures obtained from dairy milk. Is it not possible to make it fully plant-based? Also, if you used kefir in coffee or tea instead of milk, would the heat disregard the benefits? So they're probably talking about killing off bacterial species within it.
Yeah, so I mean, similarly to what we said about sourdough, you're right. It's possible that in a hot drink, those bacteria may be non-live. And so again, it depends on if your aim is to colonize your gut, then no, that's not going to be the way to do it. But it could still have, I wouldn't say there'd be zero benefit then. You could still get those exposures to those remnants of those bacteria, still stimulating your immune system. I think the first part of the question was about, is it possible to make kefir on a purely plant-based basis? I'm not enough of a food scientist to know 100% the answer to that. But what I will say is that some species and strains of bacteria, like Bifidobacterium and Lactobacilli, get those names because they are so good at growing in milk-based products. It's very efficient and effective and is their niche, if you like. And so that's why we have so many probiotic yogurt type products, is that those bacteria thrive in those environments. I wouldn't say that it's impossible to grow them anywhere else. I don't know the data on that, but I think that's part of why we see them there. But of course, it's possible to take just the capsules, but then that raises the other question of, is it better just take a capsule once a day or to eat a whole food? Is one of the challenges in nutrition.
That ties in nicely to a comment on Discord from Fred saying, would live gut bacteria survive the gastric acids in the stomach? So encapsulation comes into that discussion there.
Yeah, that's right. And it will depend on what you have it with, I think, as well. So if I imagine, if I drank, if I took a probiotic capsule on an empty stomach, that I'm giving it the hardest fight to try and survive my gut transit. If I'm taking that as part of a breakfast, it's in a food matrix, but clearly, but just to comment, there are bacteria within your stomach. There are bacteria that can survive that environment. And some of it is a numbers game. If you eat X billion amount of bacteria, some of them are going to make it through the same way that if you eat something with salmonella in it, your stomach acid is not perfect at destroying that bacteria either, and you can still end up with diarrhea and vomiting as a result. So you're right, stomach acid is there to try and deal with some bacteria, but it's not a perfect system. And so live probiotics do make it into the digestive tract.
And another comment that we've had, a question really, will the biome die if we freeze dry it? So that's quite similar, relating to exposure of
and I think the way that I think that question is worded really interestingly as well, the biome, because quite often we're thinking about bacteria in terms of freezing, but of course our biome is more than just bacteria. It's also viruses, fungi, viruses of those bacteriophages. And some of those parts may be more destroyed by freezing than others. So, for example, if you wish to make sushi safe to eat, you can freeze the meat first, and then that destroys any parasites that are in that meat and make it safe to eat. But freezing does not necessarily guarantee destruction of bacteria. Heating is probably more effective at that. So I think that's a really interesting question, and probably the answer depends a little bit on the type of freezing, whether it's freeze drying, -80, liquid nitrogen, what kind of freezing we're talking about, and also the type of pathogen we're talking about. Some are very hardy and resistant.
Yeah, and then we could get into discussions on spore formation. So let's save that for another day.
Yes,
So we've had I'm afraid we can't get to all the questions that we've had, which is wonderful. But Caroline, would you be able to provide some slides of your talk that we could send out to the live participants, because they're asking for how they can follow up on your excellent talk. So perhaps you could include some of the links.
Absolutely.
So people could follow up on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to share the slides, and I'll join the Discord for a little while if anyone would like to have a
that
chat
would
with
be
me
wonderful.
well.
So everybody on Discord, if you've got any questions for Caroline that she hasn't answered, just tag her, and hopefully she'll be on there in a moment.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Caroline.